Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ohio Huntsman Podcast with your hosts Jason, Jacob, and Jeff. And really excited to bring this episode to you guys. We talked to Mark Wiley from the Division of Wildlife, and Mark is a wildlife biologist for the Division of Wildlife, and he handles turkeys. So we talk all about turkeys. I learned a ton in this episode, one of which is during the fall turkey season, you can hunt with dogs. And I looked in the regs book, and it says right in the regs book that you can hunt with dogs, and so I'm assuming it's been there all along, and I just have not seen it. But so we talk about that. We talk about why the season dates start when they do, why there's the northeast zone, how the line was developed or determined where that line between the northeast zone and the rest of the state was going to be. All kinds of interesting turkey facts and things about turkey season that are maybe not unique to Ohio, but some of the questions I know I had about, why does the season end at noon during the first part of the season? And just those sorts of things. Why is there a fall season and a spring season? And we covered so much in this one. And so really excited about this episode. Tons of good information in here. So hopefully you enjoy it. Hopefully you learn something. Before we get into the episode, I want to talk to you about our sponsor. So as you've probably heard, we're sponsored by Monster Whitetail Grub. And so it's spring. It's been raining a lot, but it's a great time to be getting mineral out. So Monster Whitetail Grub has a couple different products. They've got straight mineral, which, like I said, now's a good time to be getting your mineral out. They've got a high-protein feed, so it's a high-protein feed it's actually got mineral mixed in, so you can kind of get the best of both worlds there. And then they've got flavored corn options. Tons of good product. We've been really happy with everything we've tried from them so far, so you won't go wrong. If you're interested in trying some of their products, they're not an Ohio product. It is an Ohio product, but they're an Ohio company that gets their product from all Ohio sources. So you're not only supporting your deer, but you're also, and supporting the Ohio Huntsman Podcast, but you're also supporting the Ohio economy. So lots of good benefits all around. So if you're interested in trying some of their stuff, check out the show notes. That's the easiest way for me to direct you to them and get in touch with them. But you can also just reach out to them on Facebook, Monster Whitetail Grub, Instagram, same thing, Monster Whitetail Grub. But there'll be a link right in the show notes, take you right to their Facebook page, and you can send them a message and get you all the details that you need. So with that, this is coming right down to the wire here. This is Monday night, and the episode's supposed to go live tomorrow. It's been, we've had sickness sort of roll through the house here. So, things have been a little behind with getting the episode ready. So hopefully you guys enjoy the episode. And without further ado, we're going to switch over to the call with Mark.
All right. We've got Mark Wiley from the Division of Wildlife on the line here. And we're going to talk turkeys. So first, Mark, I want to thank you for staying late today and taking time to talk to us. Really appreciate that.
It's my pleasure.
And so we've also got Jeff on the line. And Mark, why don't we start off with a little bit of your background? Give the listeners a little bit of your history and how it is that you came to be a wildlife biologist for the Division of Wildlife.
Certainly, yeah. So I grew up in Central Ohio, Union County. Farm boy, so I've always sort of had that outdoors itch. Always interested in hunting, although, as we'll talk about later, I'm sure Union County was one of the last to have wild turkeys show up in the state, and so I never really had much experience with wild turkey. As I got into college and pursued wildlife biology and then eventually a master's degree, I had specific interest in game birds. Did my master's work in Southwest Ohio and Northern Bob White. And then shortly thereafter hired by the Division of Wildlife as a research biologist and worked with upland game birds, ringneck pheasant, northern bobwhite. And then through sort of some vacancies and opportunities, I was able to move into the forest game bird world and currently work with wild turkey, ruffed grouse, and American woodcock.
Okay. That was going to be one of my follow-up questions, is if you only focus on turkeys or if you handle other species, and you went ahead and answered that. So, all right. So that's a little bit of your background. So I guess the listeners know this, but I guess for your knowledge, you know, Jacob's not on the call, but the three of us, we're three brothers. We grew up in Ohio, hunting Ohio. We spent a lot of time hunting in southeast Ohio in the Wayne National Forest, and grew up hunting with our dad, and that sort of led us down this path, down on this journey, if you will. And so I guess speaking of journeys, could you give us a little history, I guess a little history lesson on the reintroduction of turkeys to Ohio? How did that all play out, and just whatever kind of interesting factoids you could share with us?
Yeah, certainly. So wild turkey reintroduction in Ohio and other states where it was extirpated has been a tremendous success story. To rewind a little bit, I guess, through the mid to late 1800s, Ohio had fairly good turkey numbers, a heavily forested state. Of course, we were clearing forest at that time, but we had pretty liberal turkey seasons, mostly fall and winter seasons, and they ranged from 80 to 150 days, and essentially no bag limit.
Okay.
So that carried on into around 1900. Turkey numbers dropping pretty steadily as forests were cleared, and we had that fairly liberal harvest. And by 1911, wild turkey were considered extirpated within Ohio, so absent from the state of Ohio.
Okay.
That's largely been attributed to the loss of forest. I mean, we cleared the majority of Ohio's forest for agriculture and other uses by that time, so wild turkey really didn't have any habitat remaining in the state. But it's likely that liberal harvest and possibly some illegal harvest contributed to that loss in the state of Ohio. Through the 1920s and 30s, there were a few attempts to reintroduce turkey to the state, and principally at that time they used captive turkey. They looked like wild turkey, but they weren't really wild turkey, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's largely because wild birds were unavailable. There wasn't a strong population to go and get birds elsewhere and move them into the state of Ohio. There's pretty poor records on how many of those birds were released during that time. But as we got into the 1950s, the State Wildlife Agency did keep fairly good records of captive birds that were purchased from eastern states, even a few from the Pennsylvania Game Commission. Again, these looked like wild turkeys, but were really raised in captivity. And a few of the notes from biologists at that time, they just say they had some evidence of domestic traits, whatever that means.
Okay.
But mostly in the behavior of the birds. The birds really weren't wary of people or we could assume predators, which is pretty important for the survival of turkeys in the wild. So anyway, at that time we released nearly 2,000 of these birds in the 1950s to try to get birds going in Ohio again. That was almost a complete failure. And then we did about a 5-year analysis of that decision to use those captive birds, and decided to end that effort and again go to neighboring states and seek sources of wild birds. Fortunately, in 1956 into the early 60s, we had agreements with other states, West Virginia, Texas, Kentucky, Arkansas. I think a lot of the birds came from Missouri. But we got about 150 wild birds at that time, and they were brought into the state of Ohio. and released in some of the best forest habitat that we could find, principally in southeast Ohio. Vinton County was one of the first at the time. It's what now is Vinton Furnace State Forest. That was one of the first wild turkey releases in the state.
Okay.
And fortunately, those wild birds, that was tremendously successful, and those birds took off and did very well. And from that point, those strong populations that developed, we were able, the Division of Wildlife, the State Wildlife Agency, was able to capture birds within Ohio and then move them around to different areas of the state. Interestingly, biologists at the time thought that we would really only ever have turkeys in southeast Ohio, the most heavily forested portion of the state. The turkeys kind of proved us wrong, and they moved into all these areas that agricultural areas and so forth, places that we really didn't think they would do very well. So with that information, we ended up moving turkeys from 1960 to the late 2000s. We moved about 5,000 turkeys during that time, and we hit 85 of the 88 counties. We really only left out a few of the most heavily developed counties, Lake and Hamilton and Cuyahoga, I believe.
Okay.
Again, those translocations were tremendously successful.
And when you're doing those, moving those birds from one county to another, how many birds are you taking at a time in general?
They were winter trapping using either cannon nets or drop nets, so they would try to get a flock of turkeys in on a bait pile and net them all at once. So they were moving anywhere. I think they were taking anything they could get, but they were moving anywhere from a few birds to 2 dozen, whatever they caught at that specific trapping event. And then they had set locations. And don't ask me to recite all the counties and numbers they got. I get that question all the time. Well, how many did Union County get, or how many did Franklin County get? And, as I mentioned, 85 counties got birds. As far as we can tell, all of those releases were tremendously successful. Wild turkey survival, at least for adult birds, is pretty high, even with translocation. And at this point, we've got wild turkey in all 88 counties in Ohio.
Well, that's, like you said, definitely a success story. I know, not just in Ohio, but sort of nationally, right? The bringing the wild turkey back has been a tremendous success. And so it's just good to hear that history and sort of how things played out here locally. So I guess so now let's, if you will, let's sort of transition into present day. And how are numbers trending today? And I guess a follow-up to that, before you answer that, is how do you guys monitor turkey numbers?
Yeah, so we've got a few sort of indices that we use. Principally, spring harvest is a great indicator of turkey numbers. Our spring harvest pressure is fairly constant, which is important if you're going to use harvest as a population metric. But we do spring gobble counts prior to the spring season. We've done those for a number of years now. And then we also collect some information using rural mail carriers. So mail carriers in rural areas, for decades now, we've utilized as volunteers to record wildlife observations for various species. We added turkey to that a few years ago now, I think maybe four years ago, and that sort of survey has been used to document squirrel populations in the past and pheasant populations, quail populations. So yes, it's a really valuable resource, but principally spring harvest is what we use to track our population trends in the state. And we've been fairly stable since 2000, which is the same time that spring harvest was opened in all 88 counties in the state. So we trend right around 19,000 spring birds harvested, and we generally jump up and down around that average. And that variation, that year-to-year variation, is largely explained by the nesting success of the previous couple of years. So if you have a bad nesting year, you can probably expect spring harvest, and we would assume the general population to be down over the next couple of years.
Okay. And what causes a bad nesting season?
It's principally weather. I mean, there are certainly other things other factors that play a part. Predator numbers and habitat availability, which of course influences predation. But generally speaking, good weather conditions. If we have a nice mild spring into summer, those are good conditions for nesting birds, particularly ground nesting birds. If you get any serious deviation from the norm, so that can include cold weather, hot weather, extremely wet weather, which unfortunately we're experiencing this spring.
Yeah.
All of those things can negatively impact nest success. And then also as young poults emerge, as they hatch, those weather events can impact their survival as well.
Okay. Jeff, any questions before I continue?
I don't think at this point, no.
Okay. So we talked about sort of the metrics you guys are looking at, spring harvest being sort of a good indice for population. I guess, why is there a spring and a fall season?
Yeah, good question. So I mentioned in that long history of our turkey reintroduction that sort of the fall-winter season was the traditional turkey season in Ohio at that time, and actually in many other states. It's kind of a more recent thing, only since the modern era of turkey hunting in Ohio that spring has been king in terms of hunting popularity. So, of course, a big part of that is the breeding chronology of the birds. So spring breeding leads to summer nesting, and so that stereotypical or that real typical exciting spring hunt that you think of, you're capitalizing on the bird's breeding behavior. The male birds displaying, gobbling, not only to females but to rival males. So hunters are out there capitalizing on those males' behavior and taking those gobblers during that spring season. The fall season is just an additional opportunity. In some states, it's a much more popular season than in Ohio. Really, in Ohio, where we expect we have 60 to 70,000 spring hunters, we really only have about 10 to 12,000 fall hunters that participate in Ohio. So that fall season in Ohio is much less popular, but we still have a fair number of folks that are utilizing that opportunity. So we've had a fall season since the mid-'90s. We've had a spring season, at least in some counties, since the mid-'60s. And we can get into the biology of that if you want, how one differs from another, but they're just two unique turkey hunting opportunities that our population is able to sustain at current levels.
Okay. And so this is a theory I have, and I don't know if you guys have any data around this, but are the fall turkey hunters specifically targeting turkeys, or is it I'm going to buy a fall turkey tag because if I'm out there bow hunting and a turkey walks by, I'll have a tag? You know the sort of data on that?
Yeah, good theory. So we have some data, but it's not really direct. We don't specifically ask, hey, are you out there deer hunting? And you're going to shoot a turkey if you see one. We have discussed, hey, we probably need to just go ahead and take this step and ask folks directly. We traditionally have just not had a fall turkey, a postseason hunter survey like we have in the spring. But some information to support your theory. bow harvest in the fall is way higher than what we see in the spring. Crossbow harvest is anywhere from 20 to 30% of the total, and then vertical bow, compound, and then longbow is roughly 15% of the total harvest. So you're talking just shy of half of the birds taken in the fall are by bow hunters. Compare that to the spring, where it's only a small percentage, a very small percentage. I can't recall off the top of my head at the moment. So in my opinion, that pretty strongly supports your theory that a lot of these folks are opportunistic turkey hunters. They're probably very avid bow hunters for deer, and they happen to see turkey, or they know they're going to encounter turkey in the area they're bow hunting deer, and that's just an additional opportunity that they take advantage of. Now, that said, there are a fair number of avid fall turkey hunters using dogs and calls and busting up the flock and then bringing those birds back in. And more of the traditional turkey hunt, of course, the fall hunt, the use of dogs is legal, and it's a really unique hunt. I've never experienced it, but what I've heard about it, it just sounds like a very exciting hunt.
So I had no idea that you could use dogs in a fall hunt. So that just kind of blew my mind. Yeah.
It's again, to have it explained to you, I'm sure is nowhere near experiencing it. But the folks that I know that do it, they identify an area with a large fall winter flock of birds. They use the dog. Those that I'm aware of are some variation of an upland bird dog breed. They release that dog. It busts up the flock. I mean, moves every bird in a different direction.
Right.
And then that dog, as I understand it, waits for the hunter to arrive on the location where the flock was busted up. Often the dog sits with the hunter, which blows my mind. I'm an upland bird hunter, and I've got English setters, and the idea of getting one of those things to sit still
right.
enough that it's not going to be picked up by a turkey just blows my mind. So these must be some tremendously well-trained dogs. But after the flock is busted up, the hunter sits, and then it's almost your traditional spring hunt where the hunter is calling in those birds, just using a contact call. Hey, let's reassemble, and then brings birds in that way and takes a bird.
And even without dogs, because I've not participated in the fall turkey hunt, but my understanding is even without dogs, that's kind of the tactic, right? You're trying to that sort of assembly call, like, hey, I'm over here, everybody come this way, versus in the spring, like you mentioned, it's like the turkey rut, right? You're taking advantage of that breeding season and those vocalizations and things, right?
Correct. Yeah, that's right.
Okay. All right. So I guess that's a good, did you give a sort of breakdown of, I know you gave, spring numbers. Did you say how many turkeys are taken in the fall season?
The fall harvest, I think I maybe said permit numbers, and we didn't talk too much about, or I didn't get into the harvest totals. So spring, we typically issue around 65,000 permits and kill about 19,000 birds on average. And in the fall, we issue around 11,000 permits as a typical year. But the harvest it's typically less than 2,000 birds. The harvest rate is lower in the fall, certainly.
Do you know how that compares to surrounding states? Like, are Ohio hunters more efficient than the surrounding states, or about the same? Are those numbers sort of on par with other states?
Our spring success rates are on par with surrounding states. Fall, I'm not sure. Fall is sort of a unique season, and the variation that we see in fall harvest, at least in Ohio, we don't always have a good explanation for. Where I've said, spring harvest really seems to trend well with our understanding of the number of birds out on the landscape. The fall harvest seems to sort of deviate from that at times, where we know we've got, based on our other indices, we feel confidently that we've got a good number of birds out there, and then for whatever reason we'll have a pretty low fall harvest that year, or could, and there's not as much of an explanation there. My best explanation would again point back to your theory that there's a lot of opportunistic hunting out there.
Sure.
The harvest, or the hunting effort, I should say, is not as consistent in the fall, where we've got a dedicated group of spring hunters and a big dedicated group of spring hunters that are reliably going to pursue turkeys in the spring and pretty consistently put pressure on that population and harvest a number somewhat commensurate with the number of birds out on the landscape.
Okay. And I guess to back up a little bit, you said the spring harvest is a good indice for population. How do you correlate that to actual turkey population, right? Because I'm assuming at some point you would have had to say, yep, if we're getting, 16,000 harvest and it goes down when we actually count turkeys, or however you're doing that, it sort of matches that population trend. Harvest numbers sort of mimic or mirror actual turkey numbers.
Yeah, good question. So with any index, you're never really saying, hey, here's how many turkeys are out there, and that's tough for a lot of people to embrace. What do you mean you don't know how many turkeys are out there? So with any index, whether it's a gobbling index or spring harvest numbers or so forth, it's more of a comparison to previous years and what those levels are. There are some ways we can get some coarse estimates of the total population of turkeys. A good rule of thumb that's got some evidence in turkey research is at least at harvest rates from a previous decade, you can estimate that your total turkey population is roughly, your spring harvest total is roughly 10% of your total turkey population. So a harvest of 20,000 birds, you can estimate you probably have a population of roughly 200,000 birds.
Okay. Interesting. So we put some feelers out to our audience about, what kind of questions they would have about turkeys for you. And sort of overwhelmingly, people wanted to know, how are the season dates determined? Because there seems to be a feeling out there that the seasons are maybe too late. Like the birds are done gobbling, before season comes in or shortly after season starts. Yeah.
That's not terribly surprising. That's a common comment, I'll say.
Okay.
When our spring seasons arrive. So first, let me just say, the goal of our spring regulations are to maximize hunter opportunity to take a gobbler, but because that season is occurring during the reproductive period for the bird, we have to minimize the risk to nesting hens at the same time. So those regulations you're trying to strike a balance between that hunter opportunity and protecting the reproductive potential of the resource.
Sure.
So I'm building up to proper timing of the spring season is absolutely critical in management of wild turkey, because you've got nesting occurring at that time. So the rule in what was the statewide season prior to 2017 and what is now the South Zone, which encompasses most of the state, is the season opens on the Monday closest to April 21st. And that's been, again, the rule for quite a while now. So when we had a statewide season, that was the rule statewide. That date is based on nesting studies that were done in southeast Ohio in the early 2000s. And the researchers there, one still with the Division of Wildlife, and Mike Reynolds and Dave Swanson now, I believe, is teaching at Hocking College down in southeast Ohio. They identified the median incubation date for wild turkeys in southeast Ohio as May 1st. That median date, that's the median date that wild turkeys have initiated incubation of eggs. They're sitting on their nests, warming those eggs, and starting that 28-day process of getting those eggs to hatch. So with that, again, striking a balance between hunter opportunity, hunters, they're chomping at the bit to get out there during the spring season. They want to be out there earlier. But the trouble you have is the earlier in the season that hunting occurs, the more disruptive it can be to those, not only the fertilization of hens, which is very important. You've got to have males out there to fertilize those females. But the more disruptive it is to those nesting hens. So by utilizing the date of Monday closest to April 21st, we estimated that almost half of our hens have at least initiated laying at that point when the season's going to start. And by the midpoint of the season, you've got close to 90% of your hens incubating. Now, hunters are well aware birds are gobbling prior to that. Birds start gobbling almost as soon as winter breaks.
Right.
That doesn't mean the hens are receptive, and birds are still likely flocked up. But we try to put that season at a point where gobbling activity is still very high, and it is at the point. And actually what we hope to get is a good number of hens are bred and move off to start their nest. And then gobbling activity actually can pick up at that point, and those gobblers no longer have hens tying them up, and they're more receptive to the hunter, would be the idea.
Okay.
So it also brings up an interesting point. You mentioned that as the season starts, gobbling activity, it seems like it drops. It does. Number one, you're taking those mature males out of the population on opening day. Opening day harvest is always the biggest day of the season. So you've got birds that are, those active gobblers are coming out of the population. But then also there's pretty good evidence that hunting activity, pressure from hunters, causes birds to shut up. They just stop gobbling to some degree. So at any point that the season starts, you could expect the gobbling activity to decrease. And it almost gives the illusion of, well, they started the season as the gobbling was ending. Whereas potentially, if that season were later, that high gobbling activity would continue until that season starts, and then of course it's going to start to decrease.
Interesting. That's I'm so glad we're having this conversation, because like a lot of that is not things that I had even thought about, right? And so just sort of hearing it from a biologist's point of view is always helpful. I know for me at least to kind of get that biology, that science behind it, and go, they're not just throwing a dart at a calendar. Like there's thought behind it.
And often, when I get that call from the upset hunter, especially when the calendar shifts. So as I mentioned, the rule for the South Zone is the Monday closest to April 21st, and that's based on research in Southeast Ohio. The rule for the Northeast Zone is the Monday closest to May 1st, and that's based on a study done in Northeast Ohio very recently. And that's how we ended up with the two different zones. But anyway, when I get that call from that angry hunter, typically it's in a year where that Monday closest to April 21st rolls back, just due to how the calendar fell that year.
Right.
And I get the call and they say, oh, you're pushing the season back. Last year it was on this date, and this year it's on this date, which is, 7 days later. And I have to say, well, the rule is Monday closest to April 21st. You can plan that out year after year.
Right.
That's the rule. And you look at the calendar and you see it'll jump around. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of people that are aware that that's how those seasons are set. And most hunters, when you explain the importance of protecting nesting hens, they're completely on board with that. They understand. Now, you get that odd hunter every once in a while that'll tell you, well, I don't shoot hens, so why should we have to worry about protecting hens? And you do have to remind them that just your presence out there, if you get out there and you bust a hen off of a nest, there's always the potential that hen's going to abandon that nest and potentially impact reproduction in that region.
That's okay. Because I was going to ask, what is the potential threat to the nesting hens? But so it sounds like just disrupting them off the nest, and they abandon the nest, or maybe just having guys in the woods maybe forces them to choose an inferior nesting location. Is that a possibility?
It's a little bit of all of the above, and then there's unintentional and even illegal harvest occurring too, to some small degree. There's a fair amount of research suggesting that just simply the amount of interaction that hunters and hens have can increase the number of hens unintentionally and illegally taken by hunters.
Okay.
So it's a small number, but you want to try to minimize the interactions. And hens become really secretive as they establish a nest, and they're not as likely to be encountered later in the nesting season as they start incubation and so forth. So the timing of the season is really key in protecting hens from all sorts of disturbance, including mortality associated with hunting.
So that brings up a question. So we went down to Southeast Ohio turkey hunting the first weekend of season, and my brother basically flushed a turkey like you would, I wasn't there, but he said, we almost stepped on the thing before it took. They didn't know it was there. So could that have been a hen that was already incubating, was already on a nest, and that's why she held so tight?
There's a very good chance. So anytime I encounter a bird like that, whether it could be an American woodcock or a grouse or a turkey, a duck of various species, if they have that real odd behavior where they held tight until you were almost on top of them, that's especially in the spring, of course in the spring at this time of year.
Sure.
That's a good indicator that there's a nest either there or very nearby. Now, I've run into that where I thought, why did that turkey let me walk right up on her? And then I'll look around and I'll find no nest. And sometimes I wonder if they're not coming off the nest and trying to sneak away from me, and I just end up on top of her and she's got to go.
Okay.
She's got to flush at that point. But that's a really good indicator if that bird lets you get that close that she's got a nest there or very nearby, and she was hesitant to leave until she felt like she absolutely had to.
Sure. So I guess, sort of more biology, turkey biology, are turkey, I don't even know how I want to phrase this. Are they not like deer in the sense that the does come into estrus, and if they don't get bred that first time, they will come back into estrus? Are turkeys like you got one shot, or how does their sort of breeding cycle work?
Yeah, good question. So turkey hens can actually store sperm for a time. Don't ask me the exact period of time. So they may breed multiple times prior to nesting, and then they are essentially their laying period. They typically lay around 12 eggs, anywhere from 8 to 16. But that one breeding event, where again they might breed multiple times during that event, they are in essence fertilized for that entire laying period. And then even if they were to lose that nest early in the laying process, it would not be necessary in all cases for them to breed again and lay fertile eggs for a second nest. Now, they may very well go off and breed again anyway, but it's not necessary for them. So they, unlike a lot of mammals, they are able to store sperm for a period of time to sort of get them through that extended laying process.
Sure. Okay. So I want to jump back to, we were talking about the two different zones a little bit. And, you mentioned there was another study done in the Northeast, which is how you came up with the later start date, later season open. How did you determine where the line was?
Right, yeah. Well, I'll start that was actually the biologist before me. So I'm working off of, work that he did. Ken Duran, now with the Pennsylvania Game Commission. I'll give him credit where it's certainly due. So it's a really neat example of how hunters and the state agency and the science behind regulation setting all came together, if you'll indulge me for a minute.
Sure.
So that northeast corner of the state gets heavy snowfall through the winter, sometimes as much as 4 times the state average, and that's lake effect off of Lake Erie.
Mm-hmm.
So the state agency, the Division of Wildlife, was for a number of years receiving a lot of complaints from hunters in that part of the state that things were a little bit delayed up there, and largely due to the amount of snowfall and the severity of winter. There was concern that hens, their body condition was less than what we would find in the rest of the state. Not to mention hunter conditions. They may very well have snow at the start on that Monday closest to April 21st.
Right.
So we were getting a lot of complaints from hunters that they'd like to see a later season in that part of the state. So we did a nesting study. The Division of Wildlife did a nesting study in cooperation with a number of partners, principally the National Wild Turkey Federation. The state board gave several $1,000s for the purchase of telemetry equipment to put on hens in northeast Ohio, and then the Division of Wildlife supplied the rest of the funds for that study. In all, I think we marked nearly 30 hens over a 2-year period in that northeast corner. Most of the hens, I think, were in Ashtabula and Geauga counties. We did find through that study that nesting was occurring roughly 2 weeks later than what had been identified in southeast Ohio. So that southeast Ohio study had set the season for the entire state, and then we hadn't really revisited that until this northeast Ohio nesting study, and it did show what many of the hunters were claiming, that nesting was occurring later. So we had not only our support, we had support from hunters in that region, but we had the biological data to show, yes, this is a later nesting period in this part of the state, likely for these reasons, the heavy snowfall and other conditions. So in 2017 was the first year for that northeast Ohio zone. Now, your question was specifically about how that line was drawn. We looked at this sort of what is identified as the snow belt region, so what counties are heavily impacted by that high snowfall. And of course, it doesn't fall right on county lines, but we tried to grab the 5 counties that were most heavily impacted by that heavy snowfall, and likely had this comparable nesting chronology. And then we also looked at public ground. There was some concern about if we have this offset date and we split public property or put a substantial amount of public property on one side or the other, that we might create this situation where an area is overburdened, or it would be a less than ideal situation if we were to split a wildlife area in 2 and have one portion in one season and another portion in another season. So all of those things kind of came together, as I understand it, to identify this 5-county northeast zone that has, as I mentioned, an opening date on the Monday closest to May 1st.
Okay. So I guess along those lines, or not along the lines of the northeast zone, but sort of continuing in this thread of sort of why things are the way they are in Ohio, the noon end time, where did that come from?
Yeah. Another good question, and a common one that I get from hunters. So early in Ohio's spring season, we had that noon closure throughout the entirety of the season. And that's a regulation that you'll still find in a lot of states surrounding Ohio. The basis for it, for a midday closure to shooting hours, is again to protect hens, largely because of nesting hens are more likely to leave their nest in the afternoon. So in the warmer hours of the afternoon, they can leave the nest, handle their business, get a little water, a little food. Again, as I said, in the warmer hours when those nests or when those eggs aren't going to chill and so forth. Mm-hmm. So again, you've got that situation where in the afternoon hours, hunters are more likely to encounter those hens, those nesting hens. So this regulation has always sort of been a protection of sorts for those nesting hens. Now, that said, the impact of this regulation on hen mortality is not really known. We don't have, great data to show this regulation is important because this number of hens are going to be killed or are going to be disturbed and nest lost because of this regulation. And so it's often challenged, mm-hmm. And we do see some states that Indiana and Michigan both have all-day hunting throughout the season, but they also have some more restrictive regulations than Ohio. That both of those states have a one-bird season bag limit, as an example. Okay. So we did make a change recently. You're probably aware this was the first season that the noon closure only extended through the first week. A decision was made a few years ago to sort of expand the opportunity for all-day hunting. We wanted to ease into that because, again, as a biologist, you're somewhat hesitant to just sort of open the floodgates and say, okay, turkey numbers are good, let's have at them.
Sure.
And then you've got to roll that back if you notice that you're having some sort of negative impact. And it can be difficult once you give opportunity to the hunters. It can be difficult to pull that away from them, as you might imagine.
Yep.
So,
all right.
So we've got the noon closure for the first week to this point, and opening on the second week, you can hunt all day for the last 3 weeks.
So that'll make for sort of an interesting data point then going forward, right? You should then be able to look at the effect of that change from one year to the next.
You can, yes. And I should have pointed out, in 2010 is the first time that we went from a noon closure a noon closure throughout the 4 weeks of the season. In 2010, we made it all-day hunting for the last 2 weeks. You may remember that. Mm-hmm. That was what the statewide season operated under since 2010. So then again, this year was the first where instead of the last 2 weeks, it's the last 3 weeks.
Okay.
And in 2000, I bring that up because in 2010 we did look at harvest trends and really didn't notice any major changes. There were hunters that took advantage of those afternoon hunts. It's difficult to say because we don't have any sort of control. There were no counties, for example, that we said, okay, you're going to keep the old regulation, and these counties are going to get the new regulation.
Right,
so
yeah.
We don't really have any way to say, here's what the regulation did, because everybody changed. Every county changed over to the new regulation. So we'll have a comparable situation after this year. I'll probably look at, we've got the time of harvest from all of the checked turkeys, and I'll probably look pretty closely at the time of day that a number of turkeys were taken, and we'll try to make some comparisons. But it seems unlikely that we're going to see anything major, anything's going to jump out at us.
Sure.
Because again, we don't have that control.
And I don't know if you have the numbers in front of you, but I guess one thing that I would be interested to look into after this, sort of thinking back to that 2010 time frame, would be, you talked about like nest disruption from hunters being in the woods in the afternoon or hen disruption, I guess, if you will. If they were losing nests and therefore not producing new turkeys, I guess you could have seen there was a potential to see a decrease in harvest, right? If that's our index of population in the years following that, sort of saying, yep, the hunters being in the woods in the afternoon did have an effect because we didn't produce as many poults that spring because of hen disruption, and in the following years we saw reduced harvest numbers.
Yeah. I mean, ideally that would be how we would sort of look at that data. Unfortunately, a lot of the data that we have that we utilize is too coarse to sort of look at that fine a scale. Okay. Not to mention, we do have a reproductive index, which I failed to mention earlier when you asked about our turkey population indices. So we do ask members of the public to report sightings of turkey hens with poults during the summer months. They can report that on the division's website, wildohio.gov, during the months of June, July, and August. And then we use that to develop a reproductive index, a number of poults per hen for that year. And that's our sort of way of gauging how reproduction was that year. The trouble we have is that's such a coarse measurement that you can't really use that to look at the pre-2010 years and the post-2010 years and say, okay, it was likely this regulation change that had this impact on poult numbers. Not to mention there's a lot of other factors at play there, weather conditions during those times. There's also just the change in the presumed change in wild turkey breeding activity through the sort of the establishment phase, as we were, as turkeys were occupying new areas and colonizing parts of Ohio they'd not been in before. We saw these tremendously high poult numbers, and there can be a variety of reasons for that. It's sort of that colonizing effect where, we're occupying new places, breeding activity is very high, and reproduction is very high, and then you reach sort of this point of stability, which we're likely at now. I mentioned we've had fairly stable numbers since 2000, where we've seen poults per hen kind of drop off and hit more of a stable level where they're likely maintaining their numbers. And there can be a lot of explanations for that. As I mentioned, they've occupied a lot of the available habitat within the state. Maybe predators now are catching on to these new birds on the landscape. Hey, those are turkeys and they're prey items. So it's a neat sort of biological phenomenon, and you can kind of see that in other states too, where reproduction is at a really high pace through this reestablishment phase, and then sort of stabilizes, if not even decreases a little bit.
Okay. And so that reproduction rate, I think I read somewhere that like a reproduction index of 2, like 2 poults to 1 hen is like a stable would result in like a stable population. Is that right? Is that what you guys use?
That would be a little bit on our low side. So okay. Our typical average is 2.2 to 2.3 poults per hen statewide, and you can see considerable variation in that number regionally within the state, but on a county-to-county basis, that we don't have sufficient data to really give a county index, just due to the low number of reports that come in. But yeah, you hit it on the head. If we get below 2, that's a poor reproductive year. And unfortunately, we've had 2 years in a row below 2. 2017 and 2018 were both just below 2 poults per hen.
Mm. Okay. Do you guys report those numbers anywhere where people could go and see like, 2018 was a low reproduction year, or is that internal data?
So again, most of that information goes right onto our website. And if you go to if you navigate to our website, wildohio.gov, and then go into the sort of species information, my recommendation would be just search Wild Turkey, Ohio Division of Wildlife, and one of the top links that's going to come up is the Wild Turkey page. You click on that, and then underneath that you'll see some tabs with various information about wild turkey or whatever species page you're on. Go to the Research and Surveys tab.
Okay.
And within that, for wild turkey, you're going to see not only our spring harvest numbers from 1966 to present season, but you're going to see a figure with the poults per hen, I think going back to the mid-90s.
Okay.
So you can see those trends year to year.
We'll track that down and put a link to that in the show notes so that the listeners can find that easily. That'll be interesting.
Yeah.
So, is there, because right now bag limits are statewide bag limits, right? So is there any thought or discussion about going to county bag limits for turkeys?
Not presently, and I do receive this question occasionally as well. You know, why with deer do we see these county-based bag limits, and prior to that, sort of more zone-based bag limits, but also including county. But then with wild turkey, even though we've got that same sort of variation in abundance across the state, why do we have the statewide bag? And largely, you know, for wild turkey bag limits, they're not a major impact on the harvest level. In Ohio, of course, you can take 2 birds per season, 1 per day, and really that bag limit, in effect, it restricts the activities of the most efficient and effective hunters. You know, the hunters that could go out there and kill 4 birds, 5 birds if they wanted to, you're restricting those hunters. Our typical permit success rate is in the range of 22 to 23%. Last year was a really good year, and it jumped up to about 30 for most of our permit types. We can talk about why that happened as well. That's sort of a unique situation with a periodical cicada emergence. But in effect, you've got roughly 22% of your permit buyers that take a bird, and then an even smaller proportion of those, only a few thousand, are taking a second bird. So that season bag limit is only impacting a small number of hunters. I'm sure I know you've had Mike Tonkovich on to talk about deer. It's a very similar situation where the bag limit is while people look at that and say, well, how can you let this many hunters take 2 birds? Well, they're really not. You've got to look at the success rate and how many people are really impacted by that bag limit.
Right.
So I may have danced around your question there, but it also, you know, I get the question, well, why in the counties with smaller wild turkey populations, why don't you have a reduced bag limit in those areas? Well, it's even less likely that those people are going to be able to take a bird, let alone 2 birds, in those low population counties. And then with that, with spring hunting, you're taking males out of the population. If you recall, you know, the purpose of the goal of the spring season was to promote gobbler harvest, but protect nesting and reproduction. Right. So you're not taking those hens out of the population. You're not impacting reproduction at all, or you're having negligible impact, we'll say. So taking 2 birds out of even a county with a fairly low population, you're still not having impact. We hope if our season is set right, the hens in that area have already been bred, and many of them may have initiated nests. They're going to produce just as many young turkeys as they would if there were no season in that area. Now, what the bag limit and what the spring season does do is eliminates adult males from the population. So that is the population impact that you see. You know, adult males have pretty high survival rates, just in looking at natural mortality, predation rates, and so forth. So that gobbler you take during the spring season that's one less gobbler that would be in that population the next year, in essence. So that's the impact of the spring season, is you're reducing the number of mature males, but not impacting reproduction.
Right.
Yeah. Along that same vein, why in Ohio is the determining factor for a legal bird the presence or absence of a beard instead of being a tom? Some states say only toms, and you can't even take jakes. Some say male birds. Ohio is the presence of a beard. It has to be a bearded bird.
Yeah. Another good question, and I was not around when this regulation was set. So, as I understand it, is how I'll preface my answer. The presence of a beard gives a physical characteristic for a hunter to key in on and say, this is a legal bird. And I say that there's a variety of hunter experience levels and an ability to identify, this is definitely a male bird, this is definitely a female bird. And then biologically there can be, you might have a female that comes in and struts. And females are even capable of gobbling. It doesn't happen often, but if that were to occur and sort of fool a hunter, I suppose, you could have a situation where you've set a hunter up for in essence, breaking the law, possibly unintentionally. So, again, that beard gives the presence of beard gives a physical characteristic. Males have the beards, and then a small number of females, a very small number, a percentage or two.
Right.
So while those females then become legal to harvest, it's a number that doesn't impact the population on the whole.
Yeah.
So again, where you could have a hunter get confused, we'll say, if you say you can only harvest male birds, there should be much less confusion with the presence of that beard. Either you saw a beard or you did not, and that will generally put that bird you're looking at in the category of male or female with some females lumped in there.
Mm-hmm. So the presence of a beard, to your knowledge, is it any indicator of how successful of a breeder that hen is? I've heard people say that bearded hens are old and they're not good at breeding anymore, so it's good to get them out of the population. To your knowledge, is any of that true?
I'm not aware of anything like that. I have heard those things before, those comments before, and mainly, just sort of, we'll say, coffee shop talk. Nothing that I've heard founded in research or science. Bearded hens are certainly capable of nesting, and do. I'm not aware of any difference between a bearded hen and a hen without a beard in terms of reproductive potential.
Okay.
All right. Well, we've taken a lot of your time here, and so any kind of closing thoughts, anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to touch on?
Oh boy, I feel like I talked a lot. I probably had some longer answers than you wanted on some of those.
No, this was perfect.
I hope you got to the questions that you wanted to.
Definitely,
I encourage anybody that's got questions or concerns about the spring season, the fall season, regulations in general, contact us. Get a hold of the Division of Wildlife through various means. There's of course our website that I mentioned, or you can get a hold of district offices in all corners of the state. Call 1-800-WILDLIFE and get our call center here in Columbus, and let them know what your question is, what your concern is, and they're going to direct you to the appropriate folks. For turkey season, it'll likely be me. Give me your question, give me your comment or concern, and we'll try to work through it. I guess that's all I would say.
Okay. I've got a note written down here. I want to circle back. You piqued my interest with the cicada comment. So can you sort of expand on that?
Certainly.
Before I let you go, because we'd have hung up the call and I'd have kicked myself for not asking that question.
Yeah, I can't believe that I didn't. Again, we talked too long about. I talked too long about some of those other topics. So we've got this unique event. It's not just Ohio, but the eastern forests across North America. Periodical cicada emergences, and these are 17-year and 13-year cicada. So for those of you that aren't familiar, they're commonly called locusts and other things, but the proper name is cicada. There are annual cicada that come out every year or every couple of years, but this really unique event is every 17 years, every 13 years. So we had one in 2016, and it covered most of eastern Ohio, and the folks that are in that range are well aware of what I'm talking about. It was probably just deafening, the number of cicada that were out during the summer of 2016. Well, what that does for wild turkey is really neat. The cicada are out right about the time poults have hatched and are big enough to go and chase and gobble down these big protein and fat morsels that are just covering the landscape. So what you get is extremely well-fed poults. That's a time when they really need insects for protein and nutrition. So the poults are extremely well-fed, as are their predators. So predators of young poults, everything from avian predators to mammalian predators, even probably snakes and other things that might take a poult if they had a chance. They're all consuming cicada because they're readily available and super abundant. And as best we can guess, it's really tough to study a 17-year event, something that might only happen once during your entire career as a wildlife professional. As best we can guess, the combination of these poults being extremely well fed and their predators being extremely well fed, they jump up into adulthood in good number. Their survival is extremely high. Poults, turkey poults, I mean, and we get sort of this wave of turkeys within that cicada range. And you typically don't see the impacts of that until 2 years after the cicada event. And you probably can put together why that happens. You get a lot of people that pass on jakes in the first year. So again, we had this big wave of birds produced in 2016. In 2017, we saw the year after the event, we saw harvest come up a little bit. And a lot of those birds were jakes produced during that year in eastern Ohio. But it's 2 years after the cicada event that the harvest really shoots up. So that was last year, 2018, 2 years removed from the cicada event. Eastern Ohio had really, really good turkey numbers, and we actually had our third highest harvest on record last year, 2 years after the cicada event. What's interesting is you can look at the total harvest numbers, those of you that go to the turkey page we mentioned and look at the research section, you'll see these spikes in harvest every couple of, we'll say 7-8 years or so. Those are other cicada emergences, and you can actually see the highest harvest we have on record was 2001, 26,000 birds, and that was 17 years prior to last year's harvest. So it's the same brood of cicada that emerge every 17 years, and that impacted our 2001 harvest, and then it impacted our 2018 harvest. So it's a really neat event, and folks are going to be really frustrated that I brought it up if they weren't aware of it already, because we've got to wait 17 years
right
for the next one.
Yeah.
There is a Southwest Ohio event, and that impacted our 2010 harvest. So it was a 2008 emergence that impacted the 2010 harvest. So we can expect that in a little while down the road for those of you that hunt Southwest Ohio.
Well, I'm glad I circled back and asked you that. That's super interesting.
Yeah, it's a unique event, and it's really neat that it's not often that you have something like that and you can do any more than speculate. This is likely what happens.
Sure.
But with our spring harvest, we can look at it and say, here's a cicada event, here's a cicada event, and there's another one. It's really neat.
Cool. All right, Jeff, any last questions?
So one final question that we were getting from a lot of our listeners was basically, does predator populations affect the frequency of turkeys gobbling? Will turkeys stop gobbling if there's higher predators in the area?
Oh boy, that's a tough one here at the end, and I don't have an answer, founded in any sort of or based in any sort of research that I'm aware of. I would expect that turkeys that individually encounter a predator that's likely to impact their gobbling. But in terms of an area with a generally higher predator prevalence, I don't know if that's going to impact gobbling across the board or not.
All right. Well, we've kept you long enough. I want to thank you for taking time to get on here and talk to us. I really appreciate it. This is a really good conversation. I know I learned a lot. Hopefully the audience will get something out of this, and so I just want to thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been my pleasure.
And there you have it. I really want to thank Mark for taking time to talk to us. I really appreciate him giving us some of his time. He's a busy guy, and hopefully you guys learned something in that. Hopefully we were able to answer some of the questions you've had. Like I said at the beginning, I know I learned a lot during this episode, so hopefully you guys did too, and you got some value out of that. If you're enjoying the show, biggest thing we can ask is share it. Share it with everybody you know. Share it with your hunting buddies. Share it with somebody who might get something out of this. That's the best way you can help us. You can also, if you're interested, leave a review. That's another good way. Make sure you're subscribed to the show. That way you're getting notified of new episodes automatically. And we also have shirts if you want to get some Ohio Huntsman apparel. We have some shirts that say Eat Local on them. Pretty cool. And those are all good ways to sort of help support the show and help us keep bringing episodes like this to you. So with that, I want to thank everybody for listening.